Welcome to Transformational Thinking for Health Leaders. I'm Dr. Fiona Day, Master Practitioner Coach and Chartered Coaching Psychologist. This is a podcast that will help you meet your most complex leadership challenges and transform your perspectives, helping you to become a more effective and creative leader with a deeper understanding of yourself and your own world of work. Nick Shannon is a business psychologist and chartered coaching psychologist whose work helps organisations achieve better performance through leadership selection and development. Like me, he has a particular interest in the psychology of adult development and is the author of 2 books on meta and dialectical thinking. So welcome to Transformational Thinking for Health Leaders, Nick.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, well, my pleasure to be here.
So, Nick, we met through ESRAD, the European Society for Research in Adult Development. So, can you tell me a little bit about your journey to being a psychologist with an interest in adult development, please?
Yes, and I'll preface this by saying that I consider myself a late developer. So I'm still very much learning in the field of adult development. I guess my interest started way back when I was a teenager, because I got curious about psychology when I kind of witnessed all the interesting family dynamics going on in my family. And I was kind of wondering, why I couldn't agree on anything with my parents, and why I wanted to fight with my brother all the time. And it struck me that psychology might have some answers to that. So I started reading a bit about psychology. I came across a book by a guy called Eric Berne, who some would call the father of transactional analysis. And the book was called Games People Play. And that absolutely fascinated me and set me on a path where I thought I'd be interested to study psychology at university and see what I could do with it. But I was also interested in philosophy, and I saw the two as related. And so I ended up going to study psychology and philosophy at university.
And then in terms of kind of we're getting closer to, I guess, your interest in adult development and your involvement with ESRAD, but just tell us a little bit more about that kind of more recent chapter then, please.
I started in consulting as an assessment consultant. So the idea is simply organizations need to make the best possible choice for senior management selection. And so how do they do that? Well, most organizations have a tradition of interviewing and maybe doing multiple interviews and so forth. But very often the interviewing processes aren't that sophisticated, and there's a lot of kind of interpersonal bias and prejudice that kind of falls into that. So some organizations saw fit at the time, and I think still do, to ask a psychologist to do a totally independent assessment. And so I learned the tools of independent assessment through really contact with a variety of different specialist organizations. But I consistently found them wanting in that they seem to kind of simplify human nature, boiling it down to simple psychological traits or competencies. They never really kind of got deep into what makes somebody the unique person that a human being is. So I was always looking for something more, and I got as far as doing day-long interviews with executives, when I would give them a kind of whole variety of different psychometric questionnaires, and I'd give them some exercises, some thinking tests, possibly a kind of brainstorming test. I'd ask them to do a strategic presentation, and I'd have a kind of long conversation with them over the course of the day. And still, it wasn't really enough to kind of give me full insight. So I started thinking, where else can I go? And one of the conferences I attended, I think this was about 2006 or 2007, was a coaching psychology conference in London. And a chap called Otto Lasky turned up at the conference and gave a talk.
I've got one of his books on my shelf.
And after the lecture that he gave, he said he'd run a session with a group just to give them an example of the kind of interviewing that he does. And I went, oh, this is different. This is new. Here's somebody who's looking at things from a developmental perspective and also making an interesting separation between cognitive development, how people think and how their thinking develops over their lifespan, and what he calls social emotional development, how people feel and make meaning of their experience, and seeing these as kind of completely separate but connected. It took me a little while to absorb what Lasky was offering, but I thought it was different and had a valuable contribution to make to the kind of work that I was doing. So I found that he was doing courses online, and I signed up for those. And I think over a couple of years, I kind of took everything that Lasky offered to the point of getting some kind of certification from him as a master developmental coach or whatever that means. And from then on, I was kind of sold on developmental psychology. And I started investigating other sources and eventually caught up with the idea of going to ESRAD conference, ESRAD being the European Society for Research into Adult Development. And the first one I went to was one in 2016 in The Hague. And there the keynote speaker was Michael Bassakers. Well, I'd heard about Michael Bassakers because Lasky had based his work on Michael's PhD, which he'd written in something like 1980. So I was interested to hear Michael's take on dialectical thinking and cognitive development. And it so happened that at that conference, some Russians turned up, quite by coincidence, because they weren't members of ESRAD. They'd heard about Michael Bassakers, and they were interested to listen to him because they'd been developing their own notion of dialectical thinking, particularly working with children and school teachers in Moscow. So after all the kind of conference presentations, we sat around the table as one does, and we started talking about, well, maybe we should collaborate a bit more because we seem to have got different understandings of what dialectical thinking is all about. And maybe we could see if we could, work together on some things and try and learn from each other.
You've been quite dialectical in your approach there.
Yeah, combining opposites from the very start. Nikolai Varaksa, who was, I guess, the leading academic from Moscow on dialectical thinking, suggested that we should go to Moscow by way of a follow-up and have a few days there, just talking together and seeing how we could work together and expand our understanding. So in 2017, I went to Moscow, and Michael Bassakers turned up and a few others, and we had a great time, basically. And we learned a lot from what the Russians were doing, because they were working with children, whereas Lasky had obviously positioned dialectical thinking as something that only adults can aspire to, and something that is perhaps, I think, regrettably seen as something rather elitist, that a higher form of thinking that one can only really master when one's been through several degrees and perfected formal logical thinking, if I can call it that.
So this kind of great kind of collaboration then and sharing diverse perspectives in Moscow sounds like a kind of great moment for you. And then how have you kind of been integrating that in more recent years?
Interesting enough, we've just published the Routledge International Handbook of Dialectical Thinking, which is my best effort to integrate the knowledge that we've developed together. It is an international collaboration. It's involved Russians, who I mentioned. It's involved Australians, Swiss, Americans, and some English as well. And fascinatingly, it's a kind of spontaneous project that just came out of these conversations. We weren't sponsored by anybody. There was no organization trying to promote us or force us to do the work. We just got together, enjoyed each other's company, were fascinated by the subject, and decided that eventually we would produce a book together. That decision was taken in 2019, and it's taken 5 years to make it a reality.
Wow, well, I haven't read the book, but I have seen it, and I've looked at the table of contents. It looks like an amazing compendium in addition to the literature. I really wish you well with that, and I can hear how long it's taken to kind of fully come to fruition too. I suppose just kind of thinking, Nick, about, yourself as a leader and what you've gained in terms of insights over the years. What's the most important insight you feel that you've gained?
It's very hard to say, Fiona. I think one of the interesting things is once one comes to know something or think that one knows something, it becomes almost part of oneself. And it seems like it's kind of obvious, and you almost forget that you've had to learn it and that you didn't think like that. But I do remember in one of my conversations with Otto Lasky very early on, and he was asking me how I thought about things. And I remember saying to him, well, I think I'm a very kind of logical person. I'm quite kind of emotionally controlled. I like to think things through. I like to critically examine the arguments. And I see that as all very logical and very rational. But recently I've been finding, perhaps changing a little bit, that's not quite so important, that I use experience and intuition perhaps more. And he picked up on that, and I think he commented at the time, I can't remember exactly what he said. He made me appreciate that my own thinking was developing and had been developing all the time. And so I guess that if there's a kind of core insight there, it's that we're not fixed as human beings. We don't kind of reach a certain point and then we get stuck. We can continually develop the way we see the world. We can increasingly see it in a more varied and interesting and differentiated way. And we can continuously learn. So I guess the most important thing for me was that wherever I got to, it was not the final point, that there was more that I could learn about myself and about the world.
Oh, that's such a wonderful thing to know and to share. Thank you for sharing that. And it makes me think about that sense of transcending and including, like rings of bark on a tree keep growing, and I love that. I often say to my clients, there's no upper limit around leadership development, and that's what makes it so wonderful, because there's always more to learn and grow. So thank you for sharing that insight from your own experience there.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we are systems in transformation.
Yeah, and systems within systems transforming all the time, and really that sense of dynamism is great, isn't it? I really love that. So just some kind of bit more kind of practical questions, maybe theoretical questions, the differences between metathinking, dialectical thinking, metacognition, and are they relevant, and if so, why, to every healthcare leader today?
Yeah, well, back in 2018 and 2019, when I and Bruno Frischherz were writing Metathinking, what we were hoping to do was to find a way to simplify some of Lasky's ideas, which for many people are rather difficult to grasp. And I don't think that's because Lasky's a poor writer. I think he's a fantastic writer. But it takes you a while to get there. It certainly took me several years to get there. And if I hadn't really had a strong interest in the assessment of individuals, I don't think I would have pursued it as intensely as I did. But Lasky had always referred to dialectical thinking, and Michael Baskus had referred to dialectical thinking. And dialectical thinking has a very philosophical and perhaps a political connotation. I think now that is fading. But at the time, I was very conscious that if I wrote a book and titled it Dialectical Thinking, people might see it as expressing some kind of political point of view, associated perhaps with Marx or with communism. And so we decided that we would call it metathinking and try not to kind of highlight this word dialectic or dialectical thinking. As you can see, I've now kind of wound back on that because we've produced the Routledge International Handbook of Dialectical Thinking, so we called it what it is. But I think it's a bit of an unfortunate name in any case, because I guess you could say I see dialectical thinking now as a natural phenomenon, a psychological phenomenon that can happen to different extent within all human beings, and not something that should be seen as elitist or separate or just abstruse or philosophical. And so I rather regret the term dialectical in its associations with philosophy. Yeah, so this is a rather long introduction to the answer to your question. But essentially, metathinking was meant to capture the idea of thinking about thinking. And the idea that if we thought about our thinking, we could think in a more differentiated way. And we might see that if we thought about something in one particular way, that led us to a satisfactory answer for a particular domain or a particular topic or subject, but that kind of thinking wasn't so effective in a different domain, on a different subject. And so therefore we had to choose different ways of thinking to think about different things. And I make a distinction between metathinking and metacognition, because metacognition now is a term that I think a very useful term, but I think it's a little bit broader. Although the essence of it is thinking about thinking again, metacognition has been used, I think, by educationalists to refer to the kind of processes that people use to recognize, reflect on, and improve the way they go about learning, and possibly also making decisions. So metacognition would refer to some kind of awareness about one's thinking processes, including what is the best time of day to do your thinking, and what kind of personal biases do you have, and things like that. Well, metathinking isn't quite that broad because it's meant to refer simply to choosing one's thinking rather than all the different processes involved.
It's really interesting to listen to you talking, Nick, and to I suppose that kind of the philosophical training that you've had over the years, and kind of really hearing that coming out in terms of the your approach to this, because my approach to this is from a third wave CBT applied to a coaching context, so mindfulness based, acceptance and commitment based approaches, which are about the ability to recognize what's happening and to pause in the moment in order to make skillful choices then as a leader in terms of which behaviors to then choose, which I guess is kind of similar to what you were saying there about the educational side and the pausing into making choices about learning. But really great to have that not alternative but complementary perspective on this from that more philosophical background. Thank you. And in terms of relevance then, can anybody become a dialectical thinker? How do you become to be more nuanced in your thinking, any advice that you'd like to share with our listeners. And I really enjoyed your Metathinking book. As you know, I've just written a review of that for the International Coaching Psychology Review, which is going to be published in the winter 2024-25. So definitely direct people to that book if you're interested. But yeah, what's your thoughts, Nick, in terms of, is this something that anybody can learn how to do, and what does it really mean for health leaders?
That's deep question, and it's going to get a somewhat lengthy answer, but I'll do my best to try and summarize some thoughts on that. I mean, firstly, the work that the Russians have done suggests to us that dialectical thinking in its simplest form actually occurs in preschoolers. Young children are quite happy with the idea, for example, that their dolls are both kind of alive in one sense, but inanimate in another. Of course, a child would get an extreme shock if, in feeding their pet teddy or their pet doll, it actually opened its mouth and started taking the food. But they, in their minds, they see these things as quite alive and with their own kind of personalities and behaviors, and maybe even talking back to them and so forth. So children, in a way, are able to combine opposites, but when they go to school, they're often taught that there is only one right answer to a question, that things are somewhat black or white, that you can't necessarily combine opposites in the same way that they have been in their imagination. And that, I think, is a mistake, possibly emanating from Piaget's work when he set out his stages of mental development, that our educationalists have kind of focused on. Of course, it's very important to learn to think in a logical and in a critical way, but that's not the only way to think. And because I think that educationalists have focused on this at the expense of a more fluid way of thinking, we've done ourselves a disservice as a civilization, particularly in the West, perhaps less so in places like the Far East and China specifically. But these days, there's a great emphasis on mental well-being, and you've mentioned ACT or ACT and CBT, it's various tools. Dialectically speaking, one shouldn't separate mental well-being from physical well-being. And of course, we know this intuitively.
That was my master's dissertation back in 1999.
Yeah, sometimes we feel rotten and we can't think straight. But very often these things are treated as completely separate, that perhaps a CBT therapist might never kind of investigate the physical state of somebody. It wouldn't make any connection that their physical state or their social state is somehow affecting their mental state. Simply works on their belief system, for example. So I think we have to start connecting these things, and I think medicine is very much heading in that direction, particularly thinking about new forms of cancer treatment and selective forms of cancer treatment for different constitutions, moving from a kind of one-size-fits-all type of model to a more specialist model based on individual constitution. So in a way, and this has been a long answer to your question, Fiona, I think people do think dialectically in many ways, but they don't know that they think dialectically. And therefore, anyone can become a dialectical thinker. But firstly, they have to recognize that that's what they're actually doing. And so it helps to learn a bit of the stuff that Lasky and Vassicus have put together, because that gives them a framework with which they can understand their own thinking. But there are also costs attached to becoming a dialectical thinker. Logical thinking gives us a certain sense of security, a sense of permanence, a sense of stability about the way the world is. And dialectical thinking doesn't necessarily give you a set of answers about things. It actually gives you a set of very useful questions about things so you can develop your understanding and insight, but doesn't necessarily bring you to closure. And therefore, a dialectical thinker has to accept that perhaps there isn't a right answer here. Perhaps there is no one best way. And for many people, that's quite threatening. And I think, therefore, that cognitive development shouldn't be separated entirely from social emotional development. Because if we just develop cognitively, then we have a set of tools that we're probably not really able to handle the responsibility of the conclusions that those tools kind of lead us to about the way the world is.
I think that's a really important point. Jennifer Garvey-Berger talks about the cost of adult development, and I like to think of it as like you can't put Jack back in the box. You can't kind of go back to once you start to rewire your brain in certain ways, you kind of can't go back into different ways of thinking quite so easily, or particularly potentially different leadership contexts. You can't go back into if you've developed the ability to lead in complexity and to use some of these dialectical metacognitive tools, and to be able to be comfortable with uncertainty to a large extent, and that there are very few right answers and there are probably very few wrong answers as a leader, whereas if you were in a much more contained, kind of difficult environment where there is a set of nice guidelines that you follow, and you follow the protocol, and that's socialized into doing the right thing, and like knowing what the right thing to do as a leader, that making that transition to be able to function in complexity, can't go back to that other those other kind of environments, and there's a cost there in terms of where do people go with their careers as well.
Yeah, you mentioned an interesting word there, and that's complexity, because there's plenty of that these days, and I think kind of one inevitable consequence of having 8 billion people on the planet, then connecting them all up with the internet, is extraordinary complexity. And so if we're going to handle that complexity, we have to be able to think in different ways about it. And that's why I think that dialectical thinking, or metathinking, if you prefer to call that, or whatever you want to call it, is actually very, very important these days. And of course, we also have the influence of AI, artificial intelligence, almost breathing down our necks these days. I think that what may be critical for organizations moving forward is that a lot of jobs which previously required individuals to apply technical knowledge, where there was perhaps a manual which took you to a diagnosis of a problem and then a way of identifying a solution, a definitive solution to that problem, those jobs will be able to be done, or are able to be done, by AI. And that means that those people in those jobs will have to find themselves some other work to do. And the other work that they can do, or would be able to do if they learn to think dialectically, is to work more at the interface between whatever system or process or service or product that they are producing, and the social systems where those social systems buying whatever product it is. Because it's the way that people perceive products, the way they're positioned, the interface between the service and the way the customer receives that service that is so important to manage. And that, I think, is much harder for AI to do. There are no fixed answers there. It's pretty much kind of guesswork. But human experience and judgment and insight and intuition all combine very well to solve those kind of problems. And that's perhaps where health professionals might benefit from learning some dialectical thinking, because it would give them some different tools to think about how they relate to their patients, for example, and how they address some of the management problems within health organisations.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because there's no point in having fantastic digital kit that sits in the cupboard that nobody uses. Actually, there's something around, how do we manage that human-computer interface, and how do we learn how to do that as humans, but also as leaders, how do we learn to lead in complexity with the 8+ billion people on the planet here, and how to handle all of the unknown and unknowable leadership challenges ahead. So thank you, Nick. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I really recommend particularly the book on metathinking to others, and also your new one, which I haven't read, the Routledge International Dialectical Thinking. That's quite a lot of philosophy and philosophy of science in there, I think, as well. But anybody who's interested in this field, Nick's books are fantastic. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Fiona. My pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to find out more, head over to www.fionadayconsulting.co.uk and you'll receive 3 hours of free CPD, the Health Career Success Programme, when you sign up to my newsletter, and there's loads of other resources to support you as a medical or public health leader on my website too. Thanks for listening.